We don't want to be part of Russia. We want to be part of Europe, and we belong to Europe. And this is our very, very first demand, that we belong to Europe.
Georgia has faced its fourth nights of protests following the freeze of talks to join the EU. How's the situation looking like on the ground?
Well, we've seen a dramatic escalation in the scale and intensity of these protests. Georgia's become accustomed to having daily, nightly demonstrations outside the parliament over the past year as the government takes an increasingly authoritarian turn, introducing a slew of kind of Russian-style legislation, both branding Western-backed NGOs and media outlets as foreign agents, but also introducing swinging new crackdowns on the LGBT community and tackling other kind of key human rights institutions, platforms within the country. What we've seen over the last 3 or 4 days, though, has really changed that dynamic from protesters setting up barricades along the street outside the Parliament building briefly being on fire. We've seen people firing fireworks for the first time into the police lines, really trying to make their dissent and disagreement with the government's trajectory heard. But at the same time, we've also seen a change in tactics from the police, who, while they'd never been afraid of kind of heavy-handed ways to try and disperse the crowds using riot batons, using tear gas, now what we're seeing is really judicious use, constant use of the water cannon, constant use of tear gas, individual protesters being picked up, beaten, threatened, taken away, even opposition leaders ending up in custody.
And Washington, they said that security forces have been using excessive force, didn't they? But the Georgian Prime Minister has dismissed this criticism.
Well, Georgia's government insists that it isn't doing anything wrong, that the policing is absolutely proportionate and appropriate. But we've actually already seen the US having imposed sanctions on Georgian Dream and on police officers responsible for violence over the summer. So what we're seeing is really no change in how Georgia or Georgia's government wants to present itself to the world. They're absolutely uninterested in criticism from overseas. They've said, in response to concerns about backsliding on human rights, they've said, well, look, if that's what you're going to say to us, if you're going to criticize us, we're just simply not interested in engaging. We won't be blackmailed, as they put it, by, with your human rights concerns or with threats of withdrawing funding. Georgia receives a huge amount of funding from the EU and US to build its economy, to try and build its resilience, to try and ensure that people have good, well-paid jobs, that education, women's groups, for example, are well-funded. That's all going to change. And the Georgian government says, well, look, if you're going to criticize us, we will pull out of these programs.
What are you hearing from people on the ground? There's reports that these protests, they're spreading outside of the capital. How do we see this moving forward?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating to see protests spreading to towns and cities where there haven't been long histories of anti-government protests. So the town of Gori, about an hour and a half away from Tbilisi, one of the kind of sleepiest places, not particularly well known for political activism, to see crowds in the streets is absolutely astonishing, really an unexpected development. And I think it speaks to the fact, as many of the people I speak to tell me, that they really do believe that now is the last chance to fight for their hopes of being integrated into the European Union, being part of the Western world, something which particularly younger people for the last 15 years grew up being told. Our country has its place in Europe. This is our trajectory. Inside the Constitution is enshrined this kind of European perspective, this belief in joining a unified continent, in joining the EU, in becoming a member of NATO. People grew up in this world. And they really, really don't want to see the sun set on it. And at the same time, older people who have vivid memories of Georgia's 2008 invasion by Russia and remember what life was like when they were governed from Moscow really don't want to repeat that either. So I think what you see is these frustrations building up. And there will be, of course, those who say, well, actually, Georgia has a sovereign right to do whatever it wants. Neighbouring Azerbaijan, has a catastrophic human rights record. The difference is it hasn't said we want to join the European Union. And I think when you want to become a member of a club and you win an election or campaign in an election, as the Georgian government did just in October, promising that they'll be part of the European Union. It's absolutely within the rights of the EU and the US to say, look, guys, this isn't the way to go about it. And I think the Georgian government's got itself in this position where it's deeply offended to hear the reality that its actions have consequences, and that you simply cannot, on one hand, backslide on human rights, show absolute disdain for any concerns about the state of your democracy, and at the same time join the European Union. You know, they'll look at countries like Hungary, like Slovakia, that are already inside the EU, that are doing some of those things, not maybe to the same extent, but certainly trying to do some of those things. And they'll say, well, why, if they get to be part of the club, can't we? But the difference is, of course, that, you know, Hungary and Slovakia are inside the EU, Georgia isn't yet. And I think many people just want to see Georgia take those steps, use this open door and walk through it.
From reports I've heard as well, there's talks about, you know, they want to have another election. Opposition parties as well, they're claiming that the most recent election, it was rigged, it was aided by Russia. But do we have any substantial evidence to support those claims? The Georgian Dream Party won 54% of the vote. What do we know about these claims of Russia's potential involvement?
Well, I was at the party headquarters of both Georgian Dream and some of the opposition parties on election night. We were at polling stations all day. I was speaking to MEPs and others who were monitoring polling stations across the country. And we did see well-documented evidence of voter intimidation, of some violence at some polling stations. One of the biggest concerns was about voter ID and the secrecy of the ballot. People not having, you get your finger marked when you've been to vote so that you can't go around and vote twice. That wasn't happening, or it was happening in a completely cursory way, wasn't being checked, wasn't being implemented. So there are really serious procedural questions. Also, statisticians who've looked at the numbers, they say, well, actually, these don't seem to be quite natural, they don't look quite right. And I think as a result, the OSCE, other external monitoring groups have said, well, look, we have real concerns about these elections. The European Parliament last week passed a resolution that said the elections were neither free nor fair and did not represent the will of the Georgian people. Now, they've called, as the opposition has called, for those elections to be rerun under international supervision. There is no clear procedure to make that happen, and Georgian Dream has said it would be absurd to do so. They've refused flat out. And to kind of compound the political crisis, you have the president, who is independently elected. She's become an increasing critic of Georgian Dream, pro-Western leader, and sees herself as kind of the centre of the opposition movement now. She's saying that despite the fact that her mandate's due to expire and her position's going to be abolished by the Georgian Dream government, she wants to stay on. She wants to keep stay on in her role until what she sees as a legitimately elected government comes in. So you've got these kind of two rival power centres forming. You've got Georgian Dream on one hand, who insist they won the election, and you've got the opposition and the president who insist that they didn't. And I think what many Georgians, particularly those I've spoken to, say is the only thing that can really break the deadlock is support from the outside, and they really want to see clear messages being sent by the West. The US, as you say, has been sending some of those messages. The EU is a little bit more equivocal. You know, these are people who are going out with EU flags, standing on the street, facing potential beatings, facing the water cannon, facing the tear gas, and they're waving an EU flag. And I think what they expect from Brussels is to see some kind of support in return.
Washington, they announced at the weekend that they'd be suspending their strategic partnership with Georgia. The Georgian Prime Minister, they said they would, start up talks with the Trump administration when they take office in January. Do you think that this partnership will be re-established under Trump?
Well, it's very difficult to know. And one thing that we saw was the only EU leader who flew in to congratulate Georgian Dream on their declaration of victory in the elections in October was Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister. Orban is also a close ally of Trump. It's very clear that Donald Trump doesn't have any qualms about the state of democracy in other countries, or maybe even in his own. It's not something that he's ever really put as kind of a principle of his foreign policy. We know that Trump wants to have a rapprochement with Russia. He wants to get people around the table. He wants to begin some form of negotiations, despite the fact that it's not clear what those might look like. I think what the biggest challenge for the Georgians will be is just getting on the agenda. I don't get the sense that anyone in Trump's team or Trump himself really know where Georgia is, understand the individual, the security situation. The reason that the strategic partnership with Georgia has been so important is because it's been about supporting Georgia against Russian aggression after that invasion in 2008. Is Donald Trump interested in Georgia and supporting Georgia against Russian aggression? Probably not very much, certainly not as much as previous administrations. And I think, is Georgia interested in being protected against Russian aggression when they've done everything they can to normalize ties, increase trade, introduce Kremlin-style legislation? I don't think there's much appetite on either side of the Atlantic for that relationship to be re-established. I think what we're seeing now is a real pivot in Georgia's foreign policy, and I think it's really concerning for particularly those who've been watching the post-Soviet space for the last 10, 15, 20 years and wondering whether or not people who want to step out from under Russia's long shadow will be able to. You know, just across the border in Armenia, you've got a country that's been a historic Russian ally that had a revolution a couple of years ago and has basically pursued a process of trying to completely break with Russia, withdrawing from Moscow's military alliance, dispatching humanitarian aid to Ukraine, criticizing Russia's role in the region, introducing anti-corruption reforms, bolstering democracy, and it hasn't had any of the support that Georgia's had. I think there's plenty of people, whether they're in Moldova, in Georgia, in Armenia, who are really worrying that actually the West is not taking seriously the threat, and if you abandon these kind of revolutions and these movements, they just do simply die. And I think many people I speak to in Georgia say that's what's happening there.
The former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, claims that Georgia is moving rapidly along the Ukrainian path into the dark abyss. Usually this sort of thing ends very badly. What do you make of that statement?
Well, certainly whenever I speak to Ukrainians, I think the thing that they're frustrated about is the idea that their revolution, you know, the Maidan, was abandoned. You know, they came out with open arms and they said, look, we're willing to put our lives on the line. We want support from the West. We want to join the EU. We want to join NATO. And what did they get? They got an action plan and they got, you know, a few thousand helmets from Germany until the US and the UK really started to take the threats from Russia seriously. And I think it's really, really important that when Georgians say they're concerned about the risk of Russian aggression or they're concerned about the risk of state capture, that they're listened to and that those things are thoroughly investigated. I think when Russia says something's heading down the Ukraine path, what they mean is this is a country that's trying to step away from their self-declared sphere of influence, right? I mean, Russia has no right to dominate its neighbors. It's the right of people in its neighborhood to choose where their loyalties lie, where they think will mean a more prosperous, safer, freer life for themselves and their children. I think the Georgian people have kind of time and time again chosen that. Even those who voted for Georgian Dream, they did so on the basis that they'd be joining the EU, that things would be getting better, that they wouldn't be going down the path of authoritarianism, which they had under the previous government, which currently makes up much of the opposition. And the other thing I think is worth mentioning is that Dmitry Medvedev really doesn't speak for anyone apart from Dmitry Medvedev. I mean, the man has become one of the most fanatical cheerleaders of Russia's genocidal war in Ukraine, but doesn't seem to have much relevance on it. You know, he is the former president, having stood in for Putin briefly, was once seen as a liberal reformer, but I think now probably, you know, spends more time drinking and tweeting than maybe would be advised